Everyone, how's it going? It's Paul here, and well, I've already updated the Manga shader to a version 2.0, and there's a few really neat differences in this version, which I think you guys are going to like. So what do we got on the screen? Well, I've got a render of this now familiar pod, which is a fantastic model for showing you just how this shader works. Now, what you're seeing here is a composite of the straight image that you get with all the shaders with one key light and a freestyle render pass. Now, the freestyle render pass will be available in the demo file that you will be able to download, but of course I'm not going to add the model. I want this to be as lightweight as possible, and I want you guys basically to just take the shaders, the materials, and start using them. So let's go ahead and get into 3D Viewport to take a look at the model as it is. The shader comprises of 6 node groups. So let's take a look at the first shader in the group. So we'll delete those, and we'll go ahead and add our toon-based shader. Okay. And all of a sudden, you'll automatically notice that there is a color output and a value output. This becomes important when we're going to be adding some texture nodes. So the color output is basically your combined output of everything you see here on these sliders, while your value output is your essentially a black and white version. So let's take a look at the color output first. Now, I have, based on some feedback, done away with the single banding control and given you the option to create 3 banding levels. Okay, and by default, I've set band 1, 2, and 3 to these settings. Band 1 is set to 1. Now, doesn't necessarily mean you're married to 3 bands all at once. So if we were, say, to make that 0 and that 0, we can use band 1 to increase or decrease the delineation between highlight and shadow. And you'll see that you've got the color, texture color here, which we can also change to any color you want. We've got this lighten feature, which makes the shadow area a little bit brighter. So you're not stuck with that harsh black and color, right? And of course, we've now got this soften feature, which can give you some really soft tones. And coming up in the video, you're going to see how this soften feature actually affects some added textures. So what about this color texture input? Well, we do have this monochrome color feature. Okay, and we can, in fact, add a couple of extra bands of color. So you want a 3-band color or even 1, 2, 3, 4 bands of color. This basically essentially adds a band of color which is independently scalable from the other bands. This is a feature that people wanted. They said, well, what if I want more mid-tone, no highlight, and I want to be able to scale that mid-tone really, really small without scaling that other one? Well, now you can. Okay. Now, these bands are all dictated by this key light, which is now a sun lamp, okay? I have figured out how to use this sun lamp to pivot around 360 degrees, okay? Not only in the X, not only in the Y, but also in the Z direction, and it is 100% faithful. So if I went right round past the horizon and then rotate it up, you're going to get a lamplight direction that looks exactly right. So we've got this color texture input, all right? And what we can do with this color and texture is we can add any texture we want. Let's take this brick texture, for instance, and let's go ahead and plug this into the color texture. So it's just generated based on whatever UV unwrapping we've got on this particular model. Now, if you want a correct UV unwrap, then you're going to have to go ahead and do a UV unwrap on your particular model. To illustrate the point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a monkey head. So yeah, I've just made that pod invisible, and we've got this monkey head. Let's give it our material, which is Manga Shader 2.0. Okay, and let's give it an input which gives us our texture coordinate, and we're going to plug in UV. And so now it uses the UV information from that monkey head to correctly map on that brick texture, okay? And so now you can use your color texture here to create a bricks and mortar looking texture here. Let's take away the lightning here. And guess what? We can now add these bands of shading on top of our texture. And so if we want to lighten it up just a little bit, there we go. Okay, so you can lighten that texture a little bit there. So that's the first feature. All right, so let's go ahead and bring back our sci-fi pod so we can take a look at a couple of other things. Now, first thing you'll notice is that I have actually made, line textures here, I'm going to be getting rid of that before I release. I've actually listed the groups 1 through 6 so that they're very easy to find when you import your material. Now the next two are your halftone, so let's go ahead and add the halftone, and a new one, sketch lines, okay? And they basically do the same kind of thing. So let's go and take them one by one. We don't seem to have a mask input on the halftone group. What we do instead have are all the controls for your halftone, dot size, dot ratio, scale, and everything, right? It's also been streamlined here. Now, what you plug into the dot size is not your color, but your value. Remember when we saw that as a black and white thing, okay? So let's take a look at this value setting. And let's go ahead and let's bring these bands back to 0 and bring this lightning down to 0. And you'll see that just on a band 1, all those dots appear. That's fine for now. Now let's soften this up, and you'll already see that if I switch this object around, you'll see something very interesting. It goes from this very dark black, large dots, all the way across the gradient to smaller dots. And we can control all manner of things, okay? So we can control this banding, okay? And you notice it more when I change the ratio and the scale of the dots. So let's change that scale to something much more finer in grain. And let's play around with this dot ratio. So if we decrease it, the dots go away at 0. And if we increase it, you'll see that the dots begin to creep across that surface from that terminator. We can also do a couple of other things. We can fade out these dots if we wanted to, and it only fades the dots. So if we lightened the banding here, then you really begin to notice how that fading operates. We can also invert it so that we have a highlight here and white dots going into a black surface. And I'm pretty sure you can find many uses for these sorts of effects. Again, you can rotate the angle of those dots to anywhere that you want. And of course, scale the dots to any scale that you want, you know, something that's very, very fine grain or very large for whatever other reasons that you might have, okay? So that's the halftone group. And now this one, much like the sketch lines here, rely on the value output from this toon-based shader. Now, if you plug in the color, you're going to get some different results because this color texture doesn't exactly affect it, but you can get some very interesting results. So it's often best to use a black and white matte for the halftone group. So let's put this up here, and let's duplicate this material output so we can see what happens when we take a look at the sketch lines and what this does. So I'm going to select this material here, and I'm going to take a look at our sketch lines. Now, I haven't done much else to this toon-based shader. We've got our soften bumped up way up to 1. We've got a little bit of lighten, and take a look at what we get. What happens is that this sketch goes from a thick base to almost a pointed base. So it looks almost like a sketch line has been, you know, lifted off the page as it's been drawn across these parallel lines. Now, and of course, we've got this rotation setting, much like the halftone texture. We've got this thing called line creep, which is really interesting. If we reduce it, it makes the lines much, much shorter from the terminator into the highlighted area, but we can creep those lines up pretty prominently if we wished. We can fade out the entire sketch lines for some interesting effects. We can also invert it, which is really cool for some very interesting effects. And now the scale, of course, means how fat you have those lines. And so you can actually get some very short, fat strokes or some very long, thin strokes for that bit of sketchy texture, okay? And in combination with this toon-based shader, you can get some really nice results. And again, it keys off the value system. Now, what happens if we drop that softness? Well, let's take a look if we bring back this line creep and we bring in a couple of extra bands, okay? So let's bring in band 1 and band 2. Let's make this quite short. And let's reduce the thickness so we sort of see what's going on. Reduce the lightening, we've reduced the softness, and we've got 3 bands here going through the sketch line. Well, you'll see that each of those bands affects the thickness of that line based on the gradient. So very thick or black, as it were. Then we've got this thinner line, and then in this third area here, we've got an even thinner line. So if you ever wanted to do those, early computer graphics type of things where the shading was really, really minimal, here's a way to do it, okay? So we can get some very interesting effects using the toon-based shaders features plugged into the sketch lines or even the dot ratio feature. Now, of course, this also works for the dots. So let's go ahead and bump up the scale here so we can really see what's going on, and maybe even, no, let's bump up that ratio to something more noticeable, and you'll see that we get this black banding, bigger dots, and then smaller dots again based on where the banding is delineated. You can really notice it here on the body of this pod. So those are 2 node groups that allow you some extra texturing. What other nodes do we have? Well, we have the good old monochrome, which I might plug into the halftone over here, and the two-tone, which I'll plug into the sketch lines here, just to show you what the differences are. So let's start with the monochrome shader. We've input the sum total of our toon base and our halftone into this monochrome shader, and now we can select a color. Okay, we can saturate that right up so that we've got black for your shadows and color for your highlights. We can switch between add and multiply. So an add version colors that shadow 100% and then gives you a white highlight, whereas the multiply gives you 100% color and black shadows. And somewhere in between, you can get some really nice effects. But also, we can desaturate that until that shadow is 100% color, okay? And that works for both the add and multiply. So you can sort of see that you can drop back the intensity of that shadow and just get some two-tone color effects, which are really, really nice. Now, what about that two-tone? Well, the difference here, okay, we go output of the sketch lines, input into the two-tone, and let's pick 2 colors. Let's pick a yellow for our highlights. I like to go with this yellow and red thing because it's very, very stark, and red for our shadow area. And again, we can desaturate that, so it's just black and white, or a little bit of color. So that works a little bit differently, okay? And again, we can get a very nice two-tone comic effect there. There is one more group I am dying to show you that I think everyone is going to absolutely freak out over. Everyone's seen that movie with that superhero, and everyone wants to, focus on this really interesting rim light effect. And so, I've got a rim light node. The rim light node can be applied using, let's use a mix RGB node here, okay? And let's plug in our output into the second slot here, and let's set that to add. And we're not really getting a great feature just yet, but let's take a look at how this works. Now, I have disabled one very important item here, and that is I'm going to go back to my collection and I'm going to show the rim light object. And it works very much like the key light. So when we rotate that lamp around, you can see that the rim light follows the direction of the rim light object. So let's put a rim light right on top here, and let's control some of those features in the rim light node. So let's go back into here. Okay, so we can grow that rim light effect to get a very big rim light, or we can shrink it back. We can fade the rim light, so we can have a very minimal rim light, or we can have a very intense rim light, and we can sharpen the rim light, so we can have a very glossy type of rim light effect. Okay, let's rotate this around a little bit like that, a little bit in the X direction, like that, so we really get that nice rim light glow. And I'm going to put this back to take off the sharpen here, and I'm going to grow this a little bit because I'm going to do one more thing, and that is I'm going to duplicate this halftone group, and I bring this down here, and if we invert this and we tinker with a couple of these settings, you can see that we can get a nice halftone effect on our rim light. So this is how we can simulate that that sort of halftone comic-y rim light effect on objects such as this, and you can see that it sort of maps on really nicely, and depending on your camera angle, you set up your rim light however you wish. And so here is basically the node groups that we've got. Now that I've taken you through those node groups, let's take a look at Blender version 2.79. There's one caveat with the Blender versions in 2.79. Okay, so here we've got our setup. We've got key light, rim light, our object, our camera. I'm going to rotate this key light around. Okay, and now I'm going to go Shift Z to show us our rendered view. All right, so we can see that the key light is showing up in this direction. Now, when I click on that object, you'll notice one very important thing, and that is that I've had to run the shader through a shader node. And that is because in 2.79, the shaders are treated a little bit differently. 2.80 allows you to directly plug in even an RGB bunch of nodes into your surface, but it does not show up in 2.79. So you need to run it through some sort of shader first. That's caveat number one. Caveat number two, I'm going to select the key light. I'm going to go Shift Z to go back into rendered view. And I'm going to, well, let's split off a window here so we can be in non-rendered view. And let's rotate this light. It's not updating, unfortunately, it is not updating in real time because 2.79 hasn't incorporated a bunch of new dependencies that are necessary for that update to take place. And because the shader actually operates by, let's take a look in here. Okay, our mapping is not keying off any sort of light. This is an RGB node setup, and it is using a normal map which uses the rotation of the key light to dictate how the normal is rotated around your objects. All right. So that being said, this is just one small caveat. Now, of course, in rendered view, you don't actually see the objects as you do in rendered view in 2.8. So here in rendered view, we can actually select objects unless we go to overlays and we disable them, right? We go, okay, I don't want to see the extras. I do want to see the extras, okay? In 2.79, you don't have an option, right? So the caveat isn't that bad because you can basically toggle from this view where you can see them, okay? You rotate your light around, you move it, and then you go Shift Z and you go into rendered view and your light will automatically update, right? So there's a couple of instances there that don't work so well, but everything else from plugging in textures into your color texture to the node setup groups, okay? 1 through 6, they're all there and they work in exactly the same way that I've shown in 2.78, with that one additional proviso that you have to run your total node setup through some sort of a shader, be it diffuse. Emission I've found works really, really well. Now, there is one final surprise, which I think you guys are going to like, and it takes a little bit of explaining. These shaders not only work in cycles for 2.80, but if we were to flip our render engine to Eevee, they also work in Eevee. Yes, but what about Freestyle? Well, Freestyle now works in Eevee. A little bit differently, but it works. Now that we've got those materials on this object, let's say we'll just stick with this one, and I'm going to open up this very simple 2 render pass layout with an alpha over channel to illustrate how this is all working. Let's take a look at how it works in cycles firstly. So cycles, CPU, GPU, doesn't really matter. We tick Freestyle to enable that. And then under film, we make sure that our transparency setting is on, okay? They're the only 2 things you need to know to set up Freestyle correctly. Under cycles, our filter setting in our view layer panel means that we can switch on a bunch of these things, okay? We've got environment, ambient occlusion, surface, hair. Now, obviously, we don't need ambient occlusion, we don't even need environment, and we don't need hair. So we could, in fact, just have surfaces. But the Freestyle line set is there, and the line style is there with all the stuff that I'd done with it to sort of give it a nice inking look, okay? That's all present. So when you render this layer, okay, this is what you get. Now, I've switched on a couple of things like emission, shadow, direct color, but they aren't necessary if you're not going to do a bunch of fancy compositing. So we'll just switch those off all for now, okay? And we'll just focus on the filter. This means that the only thing it renders is surfaces. Similarly, our second render pass, line work, under filters, all it's got ticked is Freestyle. So when we render this, and I've just rearranged these so that we can see them a little bit better on the screen. If we were just to look at the line work layer, we get Freestyle, and you can see that it's got a transparency behind it, okay, which is really, really cool because all we have to do is just enable the Freestyle and we filter out any surfaces so that when we combine them, we've got our Freestyle pass over our color pass, and on an alpha over channel, we can make it as transparent or as opaque as we want. We can even switch this to a mix RGB and do some fancy effects, you know, bloom it out, blur it, whatever. And we can get some really nice effects with this very simple compositing setup. That's how it works in cycles, and it renders pretty quickly, okay? On my computer, we're getting around 24, 25 second renders. That's not bad for cycles. Now let's switch over to Eevee and see how it's done there and why it's a little bit different. So render engine, let's jump over to Eevee. Okay. Again, we've got Freestyle ticked. Now film, it's not necessary to have the alpha set to transparent, but we're going to do it. The only reason I say this is because with sky, what it does is it renders the layer behind with the sky color that you've set in your world settings, all right? And with transparent, it renders the alpha without the sky. So any objects in there, they will generate an alpha channel, and that's what you get. All right, so what happens now? Okay, well, let's go over to our View Layer tab, and let's see how this is treated. Now, first off, you'll notice that the filter section is not present. It doesn't exist here. Instead, we have some passes for Eevee, which is quite nice. So if we wanted ambient occlusion, subsurface, normal, mist, what have you, we could have that. Under Freestyle line set, we can see that we do indeed have a line set, and that I've actually got the line style just as it had been set up before. But if we go over to our main colors, you'll see that that is grayed out. Okay. Now, even though it's grayed out, it's done that because we've just come from cycles. And because we disable freestyle on cycles, it's grayed out. Sometimes if you're just working in Eevee and it does this, you're going to have to delete it because there is a chance that the freestyle line set will still render. There's no toggle for on-off for freestyle, okay? So in your main colors, it's a good idea to remove it so that in your line pass, it will still exist. And so this way, what happens is that you get a clean render and a lines render. So now let's render both, okay? I'm gonna re-render the main colors, and we'll connect that to the composite so you can see that there's no lines there. And now let's go ahead and render the line work layer. Let's connect that to the compositor, and let's get an Eevee pass on that, okay? And so you'll notice one very stark difference, and that is, let's just remove this multiply thing. I'll just set this up so that we can A and B this. What have we got here? Well, without freestyle, obviously you're just getting the shaders. With freestyle, you're getting the shaders plus the freestyle on top, but there's no way to separate that freestyle out without some sort of clever compositing and minus nodes and what have you to get a clean freestyle line set without the shaders underneath. And so that's the one caveat of using freestyle right now with an Eevee-based shader or any shaders set to the Eevee engine. So there you have it, the Manga shaders version 2.0. They're linked in the post below so you can grab them right away. I've also put in this very simple compositing node setup that will work both in Cycles and in Eevee for your main colors and your freestyle pass. Freestyle has been enabled in this particular file, but of course you're going to want to import these into a fresh file, so I'll quickly show you how to do that. Let's just open up a general file here, and let's just go and append from our Manga shader version 2.0. I would highly recommend you append the material Manga shader version 2.0 because it comes in with everything you need, and then you can delete the default light. Once you add the material to it, really you are good to go. Now, while this pod model has been pretty good as an example file to test these shaders out, I thought it was time that I reach out to a master sculptor and try something on a character model that would really showcase these node groups and what they can do. So I reached out to none other than Jan Sculpts, and he was more than happy to supply me with this character, which I spent some time producing the shaders using Manga shaders 2.0, and so you can see that there's some halftone textures on the rim light here, and there's even some sketch lines in the hair over here, but there's also textures underneath some toon shading around the place, and it's all working really, really nicely. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with a rendered view of this model on a turnaround to show you just how good this looks when it's finally rendered and composited. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you get a lot out of the shader sets, and I'll see you again soon.